Blood Games by Dan Abnett from the Tales of Heresy of the Heresy series, edited by Nick Kime and Lindsay Presley. He had been circling for 10 months. 10 months and 18 identities. Most of them so authentic they had fooled the unified biometric verification. He'd faked out 3 blind trails to throw them off his scent, one into the Slovakian fiefs, one to the Caspia and the Nord reaches, and another meandering route down through the Tyrol to the Dolomite shrines overlooking the pit of Venezia. He'd overwintered in the Bucharesti hive and crossed the Black Sea basin by cargo spinner during the first week of ice ebb. At Belhrod, he had turned back on himself to lose an unwanted tail. He had spent 3 weeks hiding in a disused manufactory in Mesopotamia, preparing his next move. 10 months. A little long for a blood game, but then he was playing it out carefully, synchronizing his movements with global patterns to follow trade routes, interprovincial traffic, and seasonal labor migrations. He was 100% certain they didn't have an orbital grid fix on him, and he was fairly confident they didn't even have an approximate. There'd been no one on his heels since Bill Harad. He trekked up country through the Balkistan, mostly on foot, sometimes stealing a lift on transports, and crossed the border into Imperial territory 303 days after he had set out. The top of the world had changed in 10 months. An entire peak had disappeared from the blinding skyline, a gap at odds with his memories. Nagging like a missing tooth, the high-altitude air smelled of pitch, molten alloys, and shaved stone. Primarch Dorn's warrior engines were crafting their polectaries, armoring the highest and most robust steeples of Earth. The smell of pitch, alloy, and stone was the smell of approaching war. Its fragmented notes hung on the bright air of the old Himalasia. The scenery was so white it scorched his eyes, and he was glad of his glare goggles. A few degrees below zero, the air was like glass, and the sun like a fusion torch in the blue sky. Perfect snows coated the peaks, and the ascents painfully white, achingly empty. He had considered the south his best option, Kathmandu and the towering central precinct, but as he approached, he realized how much things had changed. Security, which had never been less than rigorous, had cinched up as tight as a penitent's cleece. The coming war had trebled the guards on the gates, quadrupled the gun nest and automated weapon blisters, and multiplied the biometric sensors hundredfold. Vast work crews of migrant laborers serving the orders of the Masonic guilds had gathered around the palace, their camps, their workings, their very bodies staining the high snows green and black and red like algae growth. Security is tighter, but there are a million more faces to watch. He observed the labor host for 6 days, eschewing his plans for the south and turning north instead, following the high pastures and walking trails over onto the plateau, keeping the toiling host in view. Constant streams flowed down the snowy valleys and passes from Kowloon, columns of fresh workers and convoys of cargo and building materials from the Zhejiang mines. The columns looked like rivers of slow, dark meltwater or racing black glaciers. Where the influx streams met the worker armies, temporary cities sprouted into the shadow of the immense walls. Habitant towns and canvas metropoli, accommodating the migrants, corralling their animals and servitors, seeing to the needs of food and water and medicine. The unloaded materials, timber, pig alloy, mule steel, oars and ballast, stacked up around the camp city like slag heaps. Hoist cranes and magnificent derricks lifted pallets of materials up over the walls. Horns snorted and echoed around the high valleys. Sometimes he just sat and looked at the palace as if it was the most wonderful thing in creation. It probably wasn't. There was undoubtedly more feats of ancient, inhuman architecture forgotten, scattered worlds that dwarfed it or eclipsed it in stupendous scale or awe-inspiring scope. The architecture was not the point. It was the idea of the palace that made it the most wonderful thing. It was the inner notion, the concept that made it flesh. The palace was vast, beautiful, the greatest monument, the greatest mountain range on Terra, refashioned into a residence and a capital, and now belatedly, a fortress. The missing Himalaysian peak had been leveled for building materials. The recognition of that feat made him smile. These days, the schemes of man were never modest. Adopting rags and dirty leg armor, he spent 3 days laboring with the Jeanstock ogres from Nib Mongol, nicknamed the Migao. They stood slogged up and down the passes, carrying sheets of zoolrite and huge panniers of nephrite and Egyptian pebble. They dug embankments and earthworks with massive shovels made from the blade bones of giant groks, and formed hammer gangs to rhythmically sink the iron stakes that would support the concentrated spools of flay wire. At night, in the work camps, the massive jean stocks stoked over their muscled bodies with quash, a resin derived from the venom of a goby waste nematode. The substance made their veins bulge and their eyes roll white, and it made them speak in tongues. He watched the effects and made estimates of dosage and systematic duration. The Jeanstock were prepared to work with him, but they treated him with general suspicion. He tried to be just another Caucasian broadback, keen to earn a stipend and a bonus from the Masonic guilds. His papers were in order. When he tried to purchase a little quash, however, they turned sour, fearing him to be a gene whip sent to the camps to keep the workforce clean. They tried to kill him. Under the pretense of a quiet sale, 3 Jeanstock Migao drew him apart from the main camp and led him to a rock pasture where firestone and Kakalong spoil had been heaped up by porter gangs. They unwrapped a cloth roll with slices of brown resin to show it to him. Then, one drew a punch dagger and tried to insert it into his liver. He sighed. A complication. He took hold of the Migao's wrist, folded the arm around, and broke it against itself with his elbow. The joint went the wrong way, and the arm went so slack, he simply peeled the punch dagger out of the dead fingers. The Jeanstock uttered no expression of pain. He simply blinked in surprise. All 3 of them were titanic creatures, corded and slabby with unnatural hard-cut muscle definition. It had not occurred to them that the Caucasian, though extremely large and well-made, would offer them a moment's problem. One threw a punch, a blow driven with huge but desultory effort, as if it was aggrieved that he should be put into such trouble. The punch was designed to finish matters, to put the Caucasian down, his jaw pulped, his head slack in the column of his spine. The blow did not connect with any part of the Caucasian. Instead, it encountered the punch dagger, which had suddenly been angled to face it. The impact shaved the flesh and muscle away from the bone. This produced a pain response. The Jeanstock howled and tried to gather in his shredded hand at the forearm. The Caucasian shut him up by jabbing the punch dagger into his heavy forehead. It cracked in through the bone like the tip of a rock breaker's pick. The Jeanstock toppled backwards, wearing the grip of the punch dagger above his eyes, like some curious tiara. The third Miguel grabbed him from behind in an ursine hug. The Jeanstock, with the broken arm, tried to claw at his face. It was all tiresome now. He broke free of the embrace with a shrug of his shoulders and turned and drove the right hand into the Jeanstock's chest. The sternum split, and when the Caucasian wrenched his hand out again, it looked as if it was wearing a red glove. Most of the Miguel's heart was clenched in his steaming fist. The Jeanstock with the broken arm, now the only one of the trio left alive, murmured in fear and started to run away across the rock pasture. He bore the wounded Jeanstock no especial malice, but he couldn't let him go. With bloody fingers, he bent down and selected a small piece of firestone, weighed it in his hands, and launched it with a snap of his wrist. It made a noise as it penetrated the back of the fleeing ogre's head like a bullet. He fell heavy and left his hefty corpse slithered down the litter of a spoil heap on its face. He disposed of the 3 bodies in a fathomless gorge, washed his hands with snow, and took the roll of quash resin. The confluence of workers gathered around the skirts of the palace had brought, as any great body of humanity always did, lice and vermin and scavengers with it. Rad wolves had followed the workers down off the plateau and gathered at night, red eyes in the dark, catching the flicker of the campfire rings. Thousands of warhounds patrolled the camp perimeters at night, or lingered on the escarpments before the palace. The night was regularly interrupted by sudden gales of howling and barking, the growl and shiver of animals mauling one another as the faithful hounds drove off wolves that had become too inquisitive. In the darkness, it was hard to tell the difference between hounds and wolves. He had received regular psychological testing his entire life, and he had memorized all the results in forensic detail so as best to judge his limitations. He cut the quash resin into sample measures, weighing each on a set of fine scales that he'd borrowed from a gem cutter. The reinforcement of the Annapurna Gate was half done. Every day, the mouth of the huge gate bustled with thousands of laborers, and towering hoist cranes swung cradles of ceramic planing, rebar, reinforced rockcrete up over the Cyclopean arch. It was too intensive a task for the sentries to scan each laborer in and out individually. The labor gangs would snarl up and the work would run slow. Instead, the entire gate zone was covered by a biometric reader field projected by slowly rotating vanes in the eaves of the primary arch. At dawn, he secured himself under the tarps of one of the payloads due to be taken in over the gate by a hoist crane. He huddled down between sheets of mule steel and bundles of ironwood. He had pre-prepared a 4-gram dose of quash, and overdose by Miguel standards. Its efficacy was such he would be insensible less than a minute after ingesting it. He waited for 2 hours until he felt the jolt of the lift crews securing the payload's chains. He heard the steel cables of the hoist crane whining. He felt the heavy sway of the pallet he was hiding on as it left the ground. He swallowed the quash. Observation had shown him it took the hoist crane mechanism 43 seconds to bring a payload up to the clearance height and a further 60 seconds to traverse the gap over the top gate. 24 seconds into that second time period, the moving payload would enter the biometric reader field. The quash did its work. He was stiff and dead 12 seconds before he entered the field. The field read nothing except a payload of inert building materials. He woke. The pallet had set down and some of the tarps had been pulled back. Riggers and roof gangers were beginning to unload the mule steel. His body ached. Most of his muscles were cramping. He focused and performed some purging exercises to throw off the vestiges of the somatic rigor that the quash had induced. Death to most mortal men. Near death to a being like him. A brief, death-like fugue to allow him to slip in through the palace biometrics. He slid off the pallet, sore and woozy. Enormous gun boxes and shielded flying platforms were being constructed around the upper ramparts, and thick duraplating and adamantium were being bonded to the walls. Workers milled around on the scaffolds and gantries, some suspended like mountaineers over the edge of the wall's sheer drop. The air was filled with noises of hammering and cutting. Powered tools shrilled, fusion torches buzzed and flickered with Arctic blue light. Phantoms fought behind his eyes, the ghost flares of fusion cutters. There was blood in his throat. He scooped up a box of rivets and a concussion mallet and blended in with the workforce. He penetrated the outer levels of the palace. This process took a further 3 days. He stopped being a Masonic laborer and became a shadow, then a footman polishing brasswork, then a lamplighter with a spark pole, and then a doorkeeper wearing a livery he had purloined from a laundry room and a concealed displacer field to disguise his height and bulk. He followed the hallways that were dressed in diaspora and agate, and then descended the stairwells planned from solid pieces of onyx. He watched his reflection cross-polish marble floors and his shadow chase along the wall carved from quartz and sardonyx. He waited in the ivory gloom of huge processionals while war bands passed by in marching time. He lingered in doorways while almost endless trains of servitors brought past trays of raw meat and hydroponic vegetables for the high table. He became a footman again, then a carpet beater, then a beadle, and then a messenger man with an attaché box full of blank papers, hunching to disguise his build and height. Every once in a while he stopped to get his bearings. The palace was bigger than many cities. Its levels and byways took a lifetime to learn. From the rails of high balconies, he looked down into artificial ravines, 500 stories deep, filled with lights and teeming with people. Some of the great domes in the precinct, especially in the hegemon, were so vast they contained their own miniature weather systems. Microclimate clouds drifted under painted vaults. Rain in the hegemon was said to be a portent of good fortune. As far as he knew, it had not rained in the hegemon for 3 years. The custodes were abroad, watching over the inner reaches of the precinct, majestic in their ornate golden armor. Their plumed crests were crimson like sprays of arterial blood frozen in the air. The Pre Utini symbol of the lightning bolt was emblazoned on their armor. They lurked in the gloomy halls and shadowed cloisters of the palace, their guardian spears upright, frighteningly vigilant. They were impassive, silent, and they guarded their secrets solemnly. But their very presence, there was a truth to be unpicked. He noted their deployment. 2 custodes were watching the southern circuit that snaked like silver braid towards the hegemon. 2 more stood at the Jade Bailey. Another 3 patrolled beneath the fretted ironwork and the malachite of the Congressional. A lone custodes, almost invisible, held position under the waxy emerald leaves of the quaking oasis, watching the outfall of the crystal clear pleasure lake thunder down into Turbine Gulf in misty cascades. 4 more prowled the upper platforms of the taxonomic towers. There were, however, none in the northern circuit, and none on the western limits of the lake, and none in the investiary. It was so telling. They were like visible moons betraying the position of an invisible planet, bright astral bodies pushed into a certain pattern by gravitational ministrations of an unseen star. By noting where they were and where they weren't, he could determine the location of his prey. The Hall of Ling seemed most likely. From the disposition of the steadfast custodes, his prey had to be somewhere in the western hemispheric portion of the precinct, which meant the Hall of Ling, the House of Weapons, the Great Observatory, or the private apartments adjoining the latter two. But he knew the Hall of Ling was a favorite place. When he wasn't sequestered in secret toil in the deep, private crypts of the palace, his prey was known to spend a great deal of time in the hall, measuring the angles of space and time. It was said that past and future commingled at that site, and had done so since primordial times, before the palace had owned the name Ling, before his prey had been born, before the roof had been raised above it or human eyes had seen it. The Hall of Ling, long beamed and dark, was simply a domestication of one of the Materium's anomalies, a pulled thread in the fabric of time, a scab on the skin of space. He had never felt comfortable in the hall. It was filled with a tangible darkness which seemed to exhale softly, like the respiration of a slumbering god. But it was a fitting place. It would serve. He approached the hall from the southwest, following an outside walkway that had been laid along an avenue of sycamore and silver birch. He no longer wore a guise of any kind, no more fake lamplighters or pretender carpet beaters, no more displacer field to mask his stature. He had unfolded the cobweb-thin falsehood out of its tiny silver box and wrapped himself in it. It felt cold and light as snowflakes on his shoulders, his back and scalp. Light ignored him as if he no longer merited notice. It bent around him, twisted away, avoided his form, and in avoiding him, robbed him of shadows and colors too. As inconsequential as a whisper, he walked the avenue of trees and crossed the lawns behind the hall. He could smell ablative incense and hear the gentle creak and moan of the hall's unnatural harmonics. His weapon was ready. A Ney Mongol punch dagger, sharpened to a refined keenness of edge that no gene-stock knife grinder could have ever matched. The blade was laced in catastrophically lethal nematode venom, distilled and refined from quash resin. Enough to slay a demigod? He believed so. Enough to finish a blood game? Certainly. So I hope that was enjoyable. Some of these words are hard, and I was an English and theater major. I'm currently a communications major, and man, when words be getting made up, it really has an impact on your reading ability. Even with practice and stuff, there's still some I'm like, that's not a word, and the brain doesn't get it. But I hope you enjoyed that. Tales of Heresy is book number in the Horus Heresy series. That was real specific. Um, I've enjoyed this one because it's individual stories happening within the greater Horus Heresy. So for those who are uninitiated to the Horus Heresy, Horus, the favorite of the Emperor's 20 Primarch sons, two are missing. We'll talk about that later. But the favored of the sons who fought with the emperor the longest and was given the title of War Master to command the legions instead of the emperor so he could return to Terra and do whatever experiments he needed to do to further humanity. And Horus was turned to chaos. He was turned against the emperor. He was literally infected with chaos like a disease, and it took over because even though the Primarchs are demigods in a sense, they're still men. And they're not immortal. As long as no one kills them, they can live forever, but they can be killed by each other mostly. But also their own hubris can be their downfall. And what's so interesting about the Horus Heresy and the entire Warhammer mythos is seeing that no matter how great human accomplishment might be, human's still going to human. It doesn't matter how grand you think a certain figure is, how much you look up to a person, how much you admire a group, a country, or whatever it is. People are people, and people do things. A lot of times, especially when we look back in history, I mean, I'm American, so, look, I can only speak from a place of I, but like looking back at the history of the founding of my country, even things that have happened in recent history, there are some things and people that we have to love and admire in spite of what they did. So I think it's really relevant, especially with things shaping up in the world outside of fantasy, in the real world the way they are. It's stories like these that one they do provide a great level of escapism, but they are also great for just understanding how people be thinking and why they think that way. And keeps us grounded that no matter how great people are, you're no one's too great and too wise and too awesome to avoid those things that can trap us all. There's no such thing as too big to fail. It doesn't exist. And not only that, but they're just entertaining stories. And I mean, come on, Tales of Heresy, literally written for Halloween. What else was I going to do? I mean, I had to do a Tales of Heresy. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm probably going to do one more reading before Halloween, because Halloween weekend I have lots of plans like most people. So I hope you have fun if you celebrate, or if it's Dia de los Muertos for our friends in the Latin community, whatever it is you celebrate, don't celebrate, have a good time, eat all the candy, go to all the parties, have all the fun, dress up, live your fun life this weekend. So yeah, I'll be back with another reading. These are fun. People seem to like them, so I'll keep doing them. I might be finding my YouTube niche. All right. Bye, friends. Oh, yeah. Contest is still happening. See other videos for rules.